This is the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack, engaging leaders from the pharma universe. Hello and welcome to the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack. If you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, you've come to the right place. I'm very excited about our guest today, Stephen Dodge. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a PharmD MBA. He's a 20-year veteran in the pharma industry. He's led teams of both therapeutic MSLs, managed care MSLs, and he's been a VP at Merck and Intercept, and now he's the SVP of Global Medical Affairs at Madrigal Pharmaceuticals. He's a student of leadership and people management, and he's very generous with his time to share his insights with us. So, Stephen Dodge, welcome to the Pharmaverse.
Thanks, Michael. It's a privilege to be joining you and getting to chat with you today. I've looked forward to it ever since you mentioned that it was something we might get to do. So I'm excited.
Oh, yeah. Same with me. I feel the same way, Stephen. And as I've been poring over, notes that we've gone over and your background, I can't wait for everyone to hear about your story. And I hate to date you and date your age or anything, but in January of 2001, you walk into Novartis as an MSL, but then a year and a half later, you're a regional director? Many of the people I talk to and our listeners would love to know how that happened. Give us that story.
Yeah, so I think an important thing to know is when I came in as an MSL, I had a lot of leadership experience and a fair amount of clinical experience. So I ran clinical services for a medical services organization, had a very large team, had worked as director of pharmacy in a hospital, and had run my own company. And so I came into Novartis, and honestly, it's part of the journey lesson for me. At the time I joined, I didn't intend to join as an individual contributor. I didn't want to. I wanted to come in leading. And the person who was running the organization at that time at Novartis said he wanted anyone who was going to lead people to have walked a mile in the shoes of the people that they'd led. And so I did it a little under duress and joined the group as an MSL, as an individual contributor in Southern California. At the time, the team was growing, and basically said two things coming in. Said, oh, okay, I will prove that I can do the job that you've hired me to do and do it really well. And then, first opportunity that makes sense for a leadership role, I'm going to throw my name in the hat. And so I did a really good job as an MSL. I took it seriously and worked very hard at it at a time when that team was growing. And then, as is the opportunity when teams grow, and a position opened up about a year and a half later. By the way, I had already made one physical move. So I had also moved my family from Southern California to Dallas. I put my name in the hat, interviewed, and got a position that made me have to move again to St. Louis. So I made two moves with Novartis, physical moves, in the first 18 months I was with the company. So some of the secret of my success is I was mobile. My wife and my kids were willing to do that. Secondly, I was willing to prove that I could do the job of an MSL before stepping into that role. And while I was an MSL, I took on a lot of additional opportunities and responsibilities to prove that I could contribute more broadly to the organization. So that's kind of how it happened.
Those are great nuggets. But it didn't really stop at the RD level. I mean, you moved into a national director spot 4 years after that, and then a VP role 3 years after that. I mean, did you position yourself during that time? Any advice we can glean from this? I'm sure it wasn't all luck and right place, right time. That's for sure.
I do think there's a fair amount of anybody's career that's luck. I also think, and I will say this more as a student of it now than back then, is if you really understand where you want to go and you can articulate that, it does make it easier to get there. Obviously, having a destination in mind helps a lot. And if you can articulate that to people that you're working for, or that might even be the next hiring manager for the role after your next role even, they then have an eye on you if you're doing good work. I think there's no substitute for working hard and really working to understand the job you're doing and how you can contribute broadly. I'm not a natural networker, but I work well on teams. So I was also willing throughout my entire career to date, but for sure back then as I was trying to understand the space I was in, to work with my colleagues and peers. And I think, as then positions came open and I threw my name in the hat for those, I already knew the folks who were hiring those positions, and they knew me and they knew the kind of work I did, but they could also turn to their peers and people that they respected and say, what do you think of this guy? And I had worked hard to prove to those folks that I knew what I was doing and could do a good job. I think, again, mobility helped. So I was in St. Louis for about 4 years, and leading a team in the Midwest, built that team up, worked on a couple of key launches, actually had to then downsize part of that team. So I had to work through some things that were major leadership challenges, and I think did a reasonably good job with that. I was a strong advocate for my people, but I held them really accountable for the work they were doing, and they were, as a team, we were producing really good work, which is noticeable. So it wasn't just what I was doing, it was what the rest of the team that I had responsibility for was doing. I had great people. I think I learned how to hire much better during that time than I had. And I'd hired lots of people before that, but there's some skill to that, and you learn it the hard way sometimes. And so, and then I was willing to go to headquarters and do a lot of work there. So I was traveling back and forth a fair amount, and then ultimately was willing to move to New Jersey to take the VP position and even the national director position before that. Those were much harder moves. They were much harder on my family. It was challenging, but ultimately decided to do it. And then was doing an MBA at the same time at WashU in St. Louis. So it was a busy time. I look back on it now and go, I don't think I would have done it. I wouldn't do it again. But it was a great time in the moment.
Well, it sounds like a whirlwind, and but doing this podcast and interviewing leaders, it always seems like they're willing to do what it takes to advance their career and willing to take risks, and so that seems like consistent with you. And you mentioned hiring. I think one of the key things of being a great leader is being a great selector of talent. Now, I know you said you learned and there were some bumps along the way. Could you condense it down to any, like, 3 tips, the top 3 Stephen Dodge tips when it comes to hiring talent?
Yeah, I'll give you my 3. Are they the 3? I don't know. But they're ones that I rely on pretty heavily now. I think, first of all, being extremely clear about what you're looking for. And that sounds really obvious, but sometimes job descriptions don't adequately describe the job. And as a result, you're not really looking at the right candidate. So I think a really key part is being crystal clear about the job you're trying to fill and the type of candidate you're looking for, whether that is a specific skill set that you're looking for or a complementary skill set to the others that you have on the team. Really critical. So you go in with that. I think the second thing is you involve other people that you know, that you trust, that you think are really good judges of character and capability in the interview process. And that includes peers. So I routinely involve people in interviews who work in the job of the position I'm trying to fill. So it's peer or even might report to that person. I think it's critical that you do that because you're trying to hire somebody in to be part of a team or lead a team or something like that. And then the third is it's 2 things, but listen to your gut, really listen to your gut. And to the extent that you have any ability to ask people that know this person what they think, do it. If you can, hey, I know you worked with so-and-so. Everybody gives references. They're going to give references unless they're crazy. They give references to people that are going to say nice things, which is awesome. But occasionally it's useful to hear it from somebody they didn't ask to give them that reference. And if they also say great things, all the better. If they don't, you gotta pause for a moment. But if your gut's telling you this is the right person, even if maybe it's a stretch for them, or if your gut is telling you there is something off here, listen very closely.
All right.
And I think the times I've had bad experiences, I didn't listen to my gut, or I did not work as hard as I could to know more about this person than what I just saw in the interview. I mean, you know this so well. An interview is this weird snapshot, and it's extremely contrived, and it often doesn't give you the full picture of whether somebody's great or not. I've seen people who interviewed horribly and they were amazing. And I've seen people who were killer interviewers and that's about what they had going for them.
Yeah.
So.
I want to ask another question about, having even peers on the interview panel. When you're picking an interview panel to hire someone, do you feel like there could be too many cooks in the kitchen?
Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah.
When you have that group of people, is it sort of like consensus? Like you have to have everybody saying, yes, let's hire the person, or do you kind of say, hey, what's their depth of therapeutic knowledge? Or, hey, how do you think they do at the team? And you just like phone a friend on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
So first of all, I think you didn't ask this question, but
That's okay.
I generally like to have about 4 or 5 people look at a candidate, especially if it's a really important hire, which most hires are important enough that you do that. I like a pretty cross-functional group. I generally don't tell people what to ask. So I don't go, hey, I want you to dive into this, you to dive into this, even though I am bringing them because they've got perspective, skill set, or other things they bring to the interview that make it sort of a diverse interview process. You're going to get perspectives that are different intentionally, but I don't really say, hey, because you've got this background, I want you to dig into that. They naturally generally do it. But what I find is then in the debrief, so I do make it clear what we're looking for. I'll make sure they're really clear on what we're looking for. But I let people kind of do their interview the way they do it. I generally then involve people in the interview that I know are actually pretty good at it, that ask great questions, that dig where they need to, without making it an inquisition, which I also don't love interviews that are like a torture experience for the candidate.
Yeah.
I've seen them and been the victim of them. They're not fun.
No.
But anyway, when we do the debrief, the way I do it, and not everyone does it this way, is we talk about it's usually not just one candidate. We go through multiple, and I first say, is there anybody that they don't fit? And you can pretty quickly go, okay, there's a candidate that just something was off the whole time, or maybe you in fact know exactly what was off. And you don't spend a whole lot of time on them. But then when you go through the other candidates, I let everybody speak before me. And I go into the mindset, unless I am way going the opposite direction of the rest of the group, I do listen for consensus. And you get themes that pop out, and both good and bad, but you get things that pop out. And many times at the end of it, the debrief process, it's clear who the number one candidate is. And it's sometimes clear they're the number one, but there's a couple of open questions. Or it's clear nobody's saying there's a number one candidate. They're saying kind of interesting, but there's things that are off. Let's go back. I love using that process. I will make the final decision. And occasionally I've gone into an interview in the debrief. I knew some things nobody else knew. But I don't want to bias it because people change too. And you can have everybody say they're fantastic, and maybe I know something that is to the contrary, or in fact incredibly aligned with that would put them right at the top. But I want to hear about the other candidates too. So I generally really work hard not to bias it, and I give my opinion last, but not because I go, okay, I've heard everybody, here's what I think, and that's the end. I just don't want you to hear what I think first, especially if I'm the hiring manager, and it's worked well for me.
Yeah, if you're the boss and you come in, hey, that guy was great. What do you guys think? Then everybody's gonna be like, yeah, But if you leave it open ended, you're gonna get candor.
You do, and you can even choose if you got 4 or 5 people in the debrief. You can choose the order in which they debrief, so that you tend to have, if you've got a peer in there, like an MSL is part of the interview panel for an MSL, and they happen to be the most junior person on the interview panel, let them speak first. I do. Because I do think it will otherwise, unless they're really strong personality, it'll just bias it a bit because everybody else in the interview might be above them in the food chain, if you will. So I think I try to keep them very open-ended. One other thing I do is I'll often say, look, okay, were there any that just don't meet? Let's talk through kind of, are they hireable? And how strong are they? And so, if you get somebody, well, hireable but pretty weak, you say, all right, let's not put a lot of time into that person, or hireable and they'd be my number one candidate on a scale of 1 to 4, they're a 4. All right, then you talk with everybody else. And I think you can get alignment without it being kind of this just consensus decision where everybody's moving toward, it's like regression to the mean, which you don't want. Somebody feels there's a reason there's a problem, or there's a reason to really lean into a candidate, but they're not hearing it from others. You still want them to voice that, because that's where you address some of those issues that might turn out to be wrong hires or misses if you don't hear everybody speak and they don't have a chance to really voice their perspective.
Man, this is fascinating stuff, Stephen. Thank you for sharing this. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about was your experience with leading field teams, in-house teams, large company, small company. Let's talk about the company size first. Is there a different leadership style that you have to bring to a small company versus a large company, or is it the same?
I think there are aspects of it that are very much the same, and in fact, I'm grateful for the amount of time I spend at really big companies, because I think you learn some really, if they've got a good leadership development program, and or you get to lead in the structure that they have. First of all, you see a lot of good leaders. You see a lot of bad ones too, and you learn from all of that. But it gives you some structure and process that then you generally don't find at little companies. The fun thing, so I think there's some things that are very transferable, and in fact, I think it can help you be effective leading in a small company if you have experience in a big company. But you have to go into a little company recognizing a couple of things that I've absolutely recognized them, and they're no-brainers, but you have to do that. One is you have to be far more flexible on everything, and you have to be prepared as a leader to be a roll-up-your-sleeves leader, and you're going to be a doer a lot more often than in a much more structured, big, hierarchical company. And you have to be really careful as you bring other leaders onto your team that you're looking for people that can live in that environment too and are willing to do the work as well as lead. Because if you don't, they're going to struggle. And what I've loved about little companies versus big companies and leading is you have, as a leader, you tend to get to be at the grown-up table more often, where not only are you maybe leading a group of people, but you get to be the voice of that group of people in forums where the decisions are being made. They're going to really affect that group of people. Big companies, often stuff just gets handed down to you. That's been my experience. Way less common in a little company. You can be in the room and say, we should think about it this way. And, at least you've got a perspective and you can voice that. So I like that a lot. But I think developing people, coaching people, inspiring people, listening to people, hiring great people, onboarding them are about the same. I'll say one last thing on onboarding. Mm-hmm. Onboarding tends to be something big companies are really good at, because you can't hire thousands of people and not figure out how to onboard. Little companies, I've onboarded people at a couple little companies where it was a rockier road because they just weren't ready to onboard. And so you almost have to come in as a leader, and I did, and say, we're going to make the onboarding experience in our little department within this company as good as we can, because the company itself isn't ready to onboard a lot of people. But that's not an excuse. You cannot say to a new hire, hey, your onboarding experience is terrible. We're just a little company. Too bad. You just say, we'll make it as good as we can. And as the company grows around it, then you can push forward a better onboarding experience. And so I think you have to own more of those things, because they may not be built for you.
Awesome insights. And what I took away from that is, when you go to a smaller company, it's going to be more roll up your sleeves, but you're going to have a seat at the strategic table. And when you're at a small company, you almost have to think about the onboarding process and the candidate experience and the employee experience before you start thinking about who the employee is going to be. Those are excellent insights. Now, one of the things I've been dying to ask you is, you went from leading traditional therapeutic MSLs, and then you transitioned in a really smart way, I believe, into like this managed care health system liaison function. Was that just a stroke of luck, or was that a strategic move? And if so, how did you come to that idea?
It was not a stroke of luck, for sure. It was a strategic move, but it was also just a logical move in some ways. And that is, for my whole career, even before I came into pharma, I've worked in that interface between the payer and the provider and the pharmaceutical company. And in fact, that's why I initially went to work for Novartis. They really wanted the experience I had working for a medical services organization, working with medical groups that had taken on risk from health plans in California when that was kind of all the rage in the late 90s. And so it's a space I've always enjoyed. A couple different times in my career, I had opportunities to move into that space and didn't because it wasn't quite the right thing. And then when I moved to Merck, I had an option of leading a therapeutic team or building from scratch a team that would work with payers and organized providers across the whole portfolio. And it was a no-brainer for me. Merck's got a great market access organization on the commercial side. And I was like, these are going to be great counterparts to work with. And I can build the medical team with a vision that I'd had for a long time for what that would look like and how that could be done, and got the opportunity to do that. I mean, that was in part because my boss at the time, Ken Massie, let me do it. But it was something I knew pretty well already. It was something I had a passion for and always have, is how do you figure out how to work with these big organizations that are trying to manage cost of care, quality of care, things like that, as a representative of a pharmaceutical company, and in our case, as a medical representative, and build a team out that could do that. And Merck was working at the time to really understand how to best do that with organized providers too, so integrated delivery networks and things like that. And there's a great interface there, and I knew what I wanted to do with the medical capability there. I just wasn't, nobody had done it quite that way, and I wasn't sure I would get to, but I was allowed to do it, and it turned out to be, I mean, I would say it's one of the flagship-like organizations anywhere in the industry to this day.
Yeah. And it's really nice of you to bring up Ken Massie. We share a friend, and we shared a friend and mentor with Ken Massie. And I remember a conversation I had with him in 2015, and I can hear his voice. I remember exactly where I was when I had this conversation. And he said, "Hey, Michael, if you're going to pivot to any space, you want to pivot to this health systems managed care space." And he goes, "The decision maker is shifting from the doctor to all the formulary decisions now. So you need to have a team of people that are impacting that decision." I'm just curious. I've been dying to ask you for a year and a half now. Did he ever have a similar conversation with you about that, or did you have that conversation with him?
I think it was mutual. So I joined Merck in 2013.
Okay.
He had been there for about a year. And again, we sat down and we were talking, and he said, "I'd love you to come over and help me do this. What do you want to do?" And there was therapeutic teams I could lead, or I could lead this. It wasn't even named yet, this managed markets thing. And we sat down. I said, well, it's a no-brainer. That's what I want to do. I want to build a team to do that. It is where the business is. It is where the million and billion-dollar decisions are made, and it's where you can impact the lives of many patients, not ones and twos here and there. I said it's going to have a huge impact on the company. It's going to have huge impact on our employees. It's going to have huge impact on the patients that these payers are trying to support, et cetera. And it's the whole portfolio. And so we sat down and came up with the name health systems, which I don't think was broadly used at the time. And what we were trying to do was talk about the fact that it is this whole system of care. It's organized providers, it's payers, and kind of everything in between. And it is absolutely where the puck had been going for a long time. And it's literally what I was doing before I came into industry. So in some ways, it was almost circling back to that. But he and I had that conversation over lunch as I was thinking about joining, walked away going, if the offer comes through, I'm doing it. And, the offer came through. I was there for about 5 years, and, never looked back in that respect. It was a great experience. And it has, as I've gone to the subsequent companies, it has helped because I really understand. I mean, for a medical affairs person in the type of roles I'm in now, I have a better understanding for the payer environment in the United States than most people doing the job I'm doing. That never hurts. And it really doesn't hurt when you're working for a little company that might have one product and you got to get it right with providers, but you really have to get it right with payers.
What a nugget for people that are aspiring leaders or leaders that are looking to continue to move up, that is a skill set and a knowledge set that you need to have, especially if you're going to go to a small company, as you mentioned. And, Ken was such an amazing leader.
Yes.
In person and the whole thing. This episode is brought to you by K. Bassman International, the leader in pharma and biotech recruiting. When pharma executives need to make critical hires, they go to the experts at K. Bassman, pharma's one-source staffing solution. Visit kbic.com. Now back to the episode. Is there any bit of advice that you gained from him that you can share with us?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I mean, I think about him quite regularly. Something will come up at work and I'm like, the reason I just made that decision is, some conversation I had with him, some bit of insight. So I think I'll give you one that's very germane to the idea of leadership, and that is Ken was a huge champion of developing medical leaders, and he was adamant that in medical and scientific spaces, most people move into leadership roles because they're really good at something technically. They're good at some scientific thing, whatever it is. It's a technical expertise. And they become leaders without being educated on how to do it, without any training on how to be a leader. And some of them succeed and a lot of them don't. Or they do, but it's a painful process for them and the people they're leading. And so he was just an advocate of, you develop leaders. Leaders most people who are good leaders, they didn't just start out that way. They were developed, and they were thoughtfully developed, sometimes over, by the school of hard knocks, but they developed. It was a thing you grow into being. And so I'm a strong advocate for leadership development. I'm a strong advocate for identifying people with leadership interest and qualities and capabilities, and in some cases who haven't even thought about being a leader, and developing them to be good leaders and then supporting them to be successful leaders. That's something that was an absolute mantra of his, and it's something that I think has made me much better at what I do, just because I worked with him and learned so much from him. What else? I think he was one of these people that he made it crystal clear what he expected of people, and he held people accountable. He always did it in a professional and generally gentle way. But it was a combination of, you wanted to work hard for him because of who he was. I mean, he was a good guy, and you always felt like, I am doing this for me, and I'm doing this for you, and I'm doing it for the organization. But he also, felt like people need to be accountable for the work that they're supposed to do, and that this is a really important industry we're in. He used to say, and it wasn't his phrase, but look, we ain't selling blue jeans. These are drugs. These are medications that affect people's lives, and in some cases dramatically change their lives in a good way. And so you have to take it really seriously, and our responsibilities that we have individually and collectively are pretty important. And so you hold people accountable. You make it clear what it is they need to do. You enable them to do it, and you hold them accountable to do it. So he was big on performance. He was a Jack Welch student, which I'm not a big fan of Jack Welch personally, but he was a student of his thinking in this idea. And as a result, when I worked with him, I worked in groups that were pretty high performance, in part because that's just his mindset, which I think is fantastic, and it's carried over for me as well, for sure.
Yeah, I got to say, when you're sort of a nice person, when you're sort of a player's coach type of leader, sometimes that hard conversation about performance is the hardest one to have. And I think Ken was right on, and I think you're right on, that the biggest gap in our industry is leadership training, management training. That's really at the heart of why I started the Pharmaverse podcast, is because I know there's this gap in leadership training. And so I thought, why not have the best leaders in industry share their insights? And so thank you for sharing yours with us today. Sadly, we have to bring the episode to a close. but I do want to just ask one last question.
Sure.
Some of the people that are listening to this are aspiring leaders that are feeling discouraged. Maybe it's not moving fast enough for them. Is there any bit of encouraging words that you can give to someone who's in that situation?
I don't know if it's encouraging. I'll throw the couple of pearls, and I gathered these from some really great leaders. I think if you want to be a leader, and I'm saying this in the sense of you want to be a people leader, you want to be responsible for and lead teams of people. It's good to walk a mile in their shoes. I think if you have not done the job you're asking other people to do, or like jobs, you might want to go do that. Okay, which brings me to the second thing, and that is, and I've said this before when I've done talks on thinking about your career. You can think about your career as a ladder, or you can think about it as a jungle gym, and I think the jungle gym approach makes the most sense. It's got the greatest legs over time, and that is, don't be afraid of lateral moves. I was afraid of them in some cases, and I look back now and regret that I didn't make that move, because it allows you to be a stronger enterprise level leader. If you move around and you take some opportunities and some risks to say, I'm going to go do this other job that's different. It's not a promotion. It might even mean you have to take a step back to take a step forward, but I will learn something I don't know today that makes me stronger. Do those things. To the extent that you can do jungle gym, I think you ultimately go higher than if you just do the ladder. And then there's just a piece of patience. And that patience comes with get good at the things that you need to be doing in your current job, while appropriately saying, if I want to be here in 5 or 10 years, what are the other experiences and roles I need, and who do I need to know, so that when those steps open up, I'm interviewing with people that know me already, and they know the kind of work I do, and they're advocating for me. So there's a bit of a networking piece and just this general planning around experience, but that takes patience and time. I did 7 years from associate director to VP, and I've had people ask me, what was that like? And I go, I wish I had taken 10 or 12 years to get there. There were things I didn't learn and experience that would have made me better when I got there if I'd just taken a little more time.
Stephen, I got to say, this was an episode so rich with nuggets. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming into the Pharmaverse with us. And I'm sure all of our listeners are sad that it's coming to an end here, but I've gotten a ton out of it myself. So thank you. All the best to you, and really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. And I look forward to hearing this. Thank you.
Well, Stephen Dodge is a great follow on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me as well. And that wraps up another episode of the Pharmaverse. Many more great leaders still to come. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. Thanks for joining us on the Pharmaverse podcast. Make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss any leadership insights. Like and comment. I would love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next episode of Pharmaverse.